When the teenager entered the courtroom, everything was silent. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes full of fear and despair, and he seemed ready to accept a harsh sentence. In the dock was a boy, but to the judge, he was but the embodiment of all prejudice and hatred. That judge, with his cold gaze and indifferent expression, had long ago decided for himself that the boy was guilty. One look at the accused was enough for him. His skin color spoke louder than any evidence. But as soon as the lawyer took her seat and looked at the judge, the world around her changed. She saw this game, these looks, this cold bias, and she knew that something was wrong. She felt the hidden threat and realized that behind the indifferent face of the judge hides something more, something dark and deeply hidden. The lawyer knew that she had to get to the truth, otherwise the teenager's life would be ruined. This story is not just a trial, it's a challenge to the system, an investigation full of danger, and a fight for the truth. Write your name and where you're watching us from in the comments. Every response, every comment inspires us to tell stories that are important to hear. We appreciate each and every one of you and are incredibly grateful to have you with us. Because of you, our channel continues to grow, and together we can fight for the truth. Thank you for being with us. It means more to us than you can imagine. It was a sunny day, and Devin, a 16-year-old boy from a poor neighborhood, had no idea that his life would change in an instant. School was over, and as usual, he took the long way home, trying to linger on the streets so he could forget the cramped and noisy apartment where his large family lived. Devin dreamed of a better life, but for now he could only watch other people's fortunes through the TV screens, overlooking the brightly colored storefronts he couldn't afford. Meanwhile, a high-profile robbery has taken place in the city. A jewelry store in an upscale neighborhood has been vandalized, and the perpetrators have not yet been found. Cameras recorded only the vague silhouette of a young man running away in the shadows of the night. The police were under pressure. The case had been widely publicized in the media, and the aggrieved store owner, known for his connections in high places, demanded quick results. The city waited for the culprit to be behind bars. A police patrol, after receiving a tip from a concierge they knew, decided to check out nearby neighborhoods where suspicious types often hang out. Devin, who always tried to stay out of trouble, was in the wrong place at the wrong time that day. He didn't immediately notice when a police car pulled up beside him. Two officers got out, squinting, and approached him. "Hey, kid, wait a minute," one of the cops muttered, eyeing the teenager intently. Devin frowned, watching their movements warily. He knew it was pointless to explain anything to the cops. If they decided to detain him, they would. Still, he hadn't expected what happened next. "You don't know anything about the jewelry store robbery yesterday?" the officers asked sarcastically, crossing his arms over his chest. Devin shook his head fearfully. I don't know. I wasn't there at all," he muttered, feeling the fear gripping him more and more. His words were met with incredulous stares, and then the officers grabbed his arms and handcuffed him. "Looks like you know more than you want to tell, kid," he heard one of them say before he was put into a police car. Passers-by, seeing the young black man being put into the car, only shrugged their shoulders in frustration, mentally judging him, not knowing the real reason for his arrest. The way to the police station was not easy. Devin was tormented by the fearful thought that he might be accused of something terrible. He couldn't believe that a simple walk could lead to such injustice. At the station, he was met with a cold and suspicious stare. No one wanted to hear his side of the story. On the contrary, he was initially categorized as guilty. His interrogation was difficult. He was accused of being involved in the robbery without being given the slightest opportunity to prove his innocence. The police pressed him, saying that they already had evidence that a young boy from his neighborhood had been seen outside the jewelry store that night. Devin was in shock and didn't understand what was going on. So began a story where a young guy who had done nothing illegal found himself in the grip of a system that was biased and unmerciful. The court hearing was scheduled just a few days later. Both the police and the judge were in a hurry to close the high-profile case, satisfying the demands of the aggrieved shopkeeper and the public. Devin was led into the courtroom, his hands handcuffed. The hall was full of people, mostly locals, who came to see the villain who had robbed a respected jewelry store. However, there was not a single friendly look among all those faces. Devin was being judged without knowing even the slightest details. When Judge Jonathan Miller entered the room, the silence became even more tense. Jonathan Miller was known in the neighborhood as a man of iron character and stern views, but behind that stern exterior lay something more sinister. Locals knew that if a defendant of color appeared in Jonathan Miller's court, the chances of a fair trial plummeted. He was cold-blooded, almost cruel. In his decisions, he never once listened sympathetically to those he considered not his own. Davin Saturday at the table, trying not to look up, but he could feel the judge's heavy gaze on him. When he looked at him, it was obvious that he had already passed judgment. His stern face expressed contempt and dislike, and his eyes, cold and impassive, seemed to burn through the teenager. Judge Miller glanced at the case file, and his face contorted into an almost caustic grin. He interrupted the lawyer as he began to speak in Devin's defense. "Let's get right to the point," the judge said sharply, looking in the direction of the lawyer as if he were wasting his time. "This young man," he said the words with such contempt that his voice almost broke, "is noticeably experienced in this kind of entertainment." Miller deliberately added sarcasm to his words, making no secret of the fact that he regarded the accused as hardly a member of the underworld. The courtroom held its breath. Devin felt his face heat up. He would have said something, but the judge's gaze and his manner were so intimidating that the words stuck in his throat. "It's no wonder you get these types coming in off the streets." Miller emphasized the word such, alluding to the defendant's racial background. "We all know what street upbringing leads to, especially when it comes to." The judge paused, as if searching for words, but everyone in the room knew what he was going to say, and that only added to the sense of injustice and prejudice. The lawyer tried to protest, but the judge interrupted him with irritation. "Your zeal is commendable, Mr. Reid, but this case is very clear. This isn't the first time we've seen situations like this with such personalities," emphasizing again as if this was a familiar case to him. To him, Devin wasn't a living person with dreams and feelings, but just another stereotype, another societal problem. The judge continued, "This whole innocent scene is just an attempt to get out of responsibility. I have long since seen how such cases turn out in court. Character doesn't change, and neither does behavior." These words, spoken with icy certainty, left no chance of justice. The whole hall was watching this play, and many nodded in agreement with him. Without thinking about the consequences of such words, they were comfortable believing in the image of the criminal created by the court, because it allowed them to see the world in black and white, without thinking about details and facts. Judge Miller did his best to fix his position from the first minutes. His words were aimed not only at the prosecution, but also at humiliating Devin, breaking him morally and showing everyone in the room that his opinion was the only correct one. The teenager Saturday there, feeling a wave of resentment and prejudice wash over him, not understanding why he deserved such hatred. That first day of the trial ended painfully for him. He realized that he wouldn't even get a chance for acquittal. The judge had already reached his verdict, and he didn't need any evidence or facts. Devin's mother, Mrs. Jackson, Saturday on the worn couch, hands clasped tightly together in a gesture of prayer. The little room, which had always been noisy and full of life, now fell into a tense silence. Her younger children watched their mother anxiously, but none dared to utter a word. The air was saturated with fear and hopelessness, feelings that had overtaken the whole family when they realized that their son was at the center of a terrible injustice. Mrs. Jackson has always been a woman of strong spirit. She raised 5 children in a poor neighborhood where every day was a struggle for survival. However, she taught her children that despite the hardships, they should hold on to the truth and believe that justice exists. But this time, her faith was cracked. The thought that her innocent son was about to be convicted seemed to linger in her mind, but it never left her. She had seen in court that the judge hadn't even given a chance to hear their side. In his cold eyes and harsh words, she felt an insurmountable wall of bias and hatred. "My boy, he hasn't done anything like that. I know," Mrs. Jackson whispered, as if hoping that if she repeated the words enough times they would become true. But deep down, she knew that words alone would not be enough to change the situation. Devin's father, Mr. Jackson, paced the room silently, like a caged animal. He felt helpless. All his life, he had tried to protect his family from the cruelty of the outside world, from the prejudices and dangers of the streets. But how could he protect his son from a system that was determined to make him guilty just because of the color of his skin? He felt all his strength leave him. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but they all led to one terrible truth. No matter what he did, Judge Miller and the others were not going to see Devin as an innocent man. "This is a nightmare, Mr. Jackson said at last, sighing heavily. "They won't even listen to him, and they've already decided he's guilty." There was so much pain and frustration in his voice that the words seemed to tear the air in the room. Family, friends, and neighbors who had known Devin since childhood came to the house, offering words of encouragement. But even they couldn't help. A couple of them were outright doubtful, and rumors began to spread through the neighborhood. Some whispered that maybe Devin really was involved in something dark. This gossip hurt Mrs. Jackson even more and increased her sense of despair. It appeared that those they considered friends were willing to doubt their son just because he was at the center of a legal scandal. Her daughter, 13-year-old Lily, realized for the first time how unfairly the world could treat people because of their origin and skin color. Lily was a smart and serious girl, but the events of the past few days had shaken her deeply. She saw her mother's tears and the anger in her father's eyes, and it made her bitter and incomprehensible. She could not understand why the world was so cruel, and why the judge did not even give her brother a chance to prove his innocence. Mrs. Jackson realized that if Devin was convicted, it would destroy their family. A conviction would change their lives forever, and the stigma of criminal would haunt them forever. Her heart clenched with pain at the thought that her son could be robbed of his future. He was a dreamy teenager who loved to play basketball and dreamed of going to college. She knew he would never do anything like what he was accused of. "We can't just sit back," Mrs. Jackson finally said with a firmness her family knew and respected. "We have to fight for him. We have to find someone who believes in him as much as we do." The next day, she started looking for lawyers, but each conversation only added to her despair. Some frankly said their chances were slim. Others refused to take the case, citing that the evidence against them was too strong. The further she searched, the heavier it became on her heart. With each rejection, her faith in justice faded, leaving room for fear. Devin's family was on edge. They realized that the judge's bias and influence on the court could destroy their future. They realized that the judge's bias and the influence of the court could destroy their future. Hope was fading with each passing day, but at the same time, despair was growing, driving them to the decision to fight to the end, even if it was the last thing they could do for their son. Mrs. Jackson was at a profound loss. Since her son's arrest, she had been trying to find a lawyer who could fairly and coolly take up his defense, but each day brought only more rejection and indifference. She was about to give up hope when an acquaintance mentioned the name of a man who was called nothing less than the lawyer for the lost. He was Elias Hunt, an accomplished lawyer who had made a name for himself as a defender of those whom society had already condemned. It was said that he was not afraid of a challenge and was always eager to get to the truth, even if it was not favorable to him. Mrs. Jackson was relieved to hear of this lawyer. She realized that Hunt was her last chance and decided to see him at all costs. The next day, she struggled to scrape together the last of her money, hired a cab, and went to his office, which was in the center of town. The office was modest but cozy, and the walls were hung with numerous diplomas and awards. Elias Hunt was a tall, serious man with a keen, attentive eye. His face was stern, but there was a light of keen interest and determination in his eyes. When Mrs. Jackson began to tell him the story of her son, Elias listened without interruption. As she shared the details, tears came to her eyes several times, but she restrained herself. Hunt showed no pity or sympathy. He just listened, and that was trustworthy. When she finished, the lawyer sighed and was silent for a few seconds, looking away. Then he looked her straight in the eye and said, "I've seen cases like this before, Mrs. Jackson, and unfortunately, I have to admit, if your son is truly innocent, he needs not just a defense, but a desperate one. This case is already full of bias, and the system is bent on making him guilty without looking at the details. But can you help him?" she asked hopefully. "I'll take the case," Hunt replied, determination in his voice. "I am well aware of how it may turn out for me." This Judge Miller is known for his harshness and hatred of people of another race, but it's not the first time I face such courts. "I'll risk my reputation for your son, Mrs. Jackson. It's not the first time I've done that." Mrs. Jackson was relieved for the first time in many days. She felt that Hunt had really taken her son's story to heart. Though he may not have been overly emotional, there was something more to his words. a desire to stand up to injustice. She knew that this man wasn't just defending her son. He was going against a system that was used to not giving people like them a chance. The next day, Elias Hunt sprang into action. The first thing he did was to request all the case files and review the evidence. His experienced eye immediately noted many oddities and inconsistencies. The surveillance cameras from the jewelry store showed only a silhouette of the suspect, but no clear image that could identify Devon. Evidence of the team's presence at the crime scene was virtually non-existent. Witnesses' testimony was also questionable. They saw a teenager with a dark complexion but could not describe his face. As Hunt delved deeper into the case, he realized how far-fetched and built on conjecture it was. He knew that such cases with racial bias and biased judges were always difficult, but the more he dug into the details, the more he saw that Devon's arrest was a gross act of discrimination, brought about by pressure from those who wanted to find the guilty party at any cost. Elias Hunt collected all the inconsistencies and contradictions in the prosecution's case. He knew it would be a tough fight, because Judge Miller did not like to be contradicted. Miller was a man who was used to having complete control over the trial and the outcome of his cases. Hunt realized that he had to fight not only for Devon, but for the very essence of justice. Soon Hunt visited Devon in the detention center. The teenager looked depressed and exhausted, but there was still a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Hunt realized that the boy didn't look like a criminalist fright, but honest eyes spoke for themselves. "Listen to me, Devon," Hunt spoke calmly. "I'm here to help you. I believe in your innocence, and we're going to prove it. But to do that, you need to be patient and trust me. It's a difficult case, but I'll be by your side until the end." Devon, barely holding back tears, nodded. This was the first person who not only talked to him like a human being, but actually believed in him. This day was the beginning of a new chapter, full of hope and determination. There was a hard battle ahead, but now he had someone who was willing to fight for him, not for money, not for fame, but for truth and justice itself. Elias Hunt was more than just an experienced lawyer. Behind his career and reputation was a personal story that only a small circle of people knew about. Although he became famous as a defender of those whom society was ready to condemn without evidence, his motivation went much deeper. Devon's case was not just a case for him, it was his personal battle with a system he himself had once believed in, but which had betrayed him. Years earlier, Hunt had been through a similar hell himself. His younger brother, Michael, had been arrested on a false theft charge, and back then Elias, still a young law student, had been powerless to do anything about it. Michael had been held on suspicion with no hard evidence, and his judge, like Miller now, was unwilling to treat him as innocent. Michael, then a 17-year-old teenager, was at the center of a scandal. Even though no evidence existed, he was simply the right suspect, a young black man in the right place at the right time. The court hearing was fast and brutal. The judge insisted on guilt, not allowing the defense attorney to put forward evidence in Michael's favor. And no matter how hard Hunt and his family tried to help his brother, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Michael ended up in prison, and it broke him. Prison life, cruelty and humiliation left a mark on him that he could not overcome. Returning home years later, Michael was a different person, depressed and traumatized. 6 months after his release, he took his own life, leaving behind a trail of pain and loss that Elias has lived with ever since. That terrifying experience changed Hunt forever. He knew he couldn't save his brother, but vowed to use his life and knowledge to protect those in similar situations. He has since become an advocate for those who have been written off by the system and placed in the position of guilty without proof. He knew how cruel the system could be to those deemed different, and it infuriated him. When Mrs. Jackson came into his office, he immediately sensed something familiar in her desperate plea. With every word she said, with every detail, he felt a familiar sense of anger and determination rise up in him. He saw Devon as his brother, who was also young, scared, and unjustly accused. The teenager's case had become more than just a professional task for Hunt. It had taken on personal meaning. It was a chance for him to confront those who had ruined his life and the lives of his family. Elias Hunt knew this case would not be an easy one. Judge Miller was known not only for his harshness, but also for his connections to high-ranking people that made him virtually untouchable. Miller was the epitome of the very bias that had ruined Michael. Hunt understood that Miller and his kind felt untouchable and unafraid to make decisions that could ruin another person's life. but the lawyer was willing to do anything to show Miller that he was wrong. At night, when Elias was reviewing the case file and planning his defense, the memory of his brother came back to him. He saw him being led away in handcuffs, standing before a cold and indifferent judge, unaware of what awaited him. Those memories gave Hunt the strength and rage he channeled into Devon's case. This was his chance to exact revenge on the system that had broken his brother, and perhaps at least somewhat restore the sense of justice he'd been deprived of years ago. When Elias spoke to Devon, he tried not to show his emotions, but the boy sensed that the lawyer truly believed in him. Devon didn't know that Hunt had personal reasons for fighting the case, but he felt that the man might be the only one willing to go all the way for his freedom. For Hunt, the case against Judge Miller became his life's work. He saw it not only as a way to prove Devon's innocence, but also as an opportunity to expose a system that had so many times taken the future away from people like his brother. He knew that if he could win, it would not just be an acquittal for Devon, but another battle in his personal war for justice. Now Elias Hunt was determined. His past and personal tragedy had made him a fighter who feared nothing, and he was ready to use every skill he had, every bit of experience, to get to the truth. For him, this case was not only a job, but a chance to honor Michael's memory by preventing other judges and police officers from ruining another life. Elias Hunt knew he had to dig deeper than anyone before him to win this case. The court records he had managed to obtain were inconclusive and full of gaps, but that only fueled his curiosity and determination. He realized that if the case was built on bias, the entire chain of evidence must contain errors, oversights, and possibly outright fabrications. The first thing that caught his eye was the testimony of witnesses. Witnesses claimed to have seen a dark-skinned teenager near the crime scene, but on closer examination, it became clear that none of the witnesses could give an accurate description of the alleged perpetrator's appearance. They all spoke only of a dark-skinned young man in a hoodie, which was a generic and unconvincing description. Hunt knew that such testimony was more often based on bias than on actual perception, and its reliability could easily be questioned. Next, Elias decided to review the surveillance tapes. The police had presented the tapes as one of the key pieces of evidence, but as soon as Hunt reviewed them, his professional eye immediately picked up an oddity. The tape showed a silhouette, but the image was blurry and no distinguishing features were visible. All that could be seen was a rough high-end clothing that matched the general characteristics, but that was clearly not enough to make a confident accusation. Hunt noticed one detail. The alleged perpetrator in the recording moved confidently for the person who, according to the investigation, committed the robbery. He wondered, could the teenager, according to the prosecution, had never been involved in criminal activity, really get away so quickly and easily without leaving a trace? His doubts grew when he examined Devon's arrest report. The cops claimed to have arrested him based on his resemblance to the figure on the tape, but somehow failed to mention that Devon had an alibi. On the day the robbery occurred, Devon was at home with his younger siblings. Despite this, the police ignored the alibi, claiming that there was no evidence of his presence at home. Hunt knew that this deliberate disregard of the alibi was a serious error on the part of the investigation and was going to be used in court. In addition, the lawyer noticed that the interrogation protocols were executed with violations. They did not mention that Devon was not given the opportunity to call a lawyer at the moment of detention, which violated his rights. Moreover, the police pressured the teenager by using threats and intimidation to get a confession out of him, although it claimed from the beginning that it had nothing to do with the crime. Hunt decided to question the police officers involved in the arrest. During the conversation with one of them, he noticed how he avoided direct answers and answered some questions unconvincingly, diverting the conversation. This reinforced Hunt's suspicions that the police officers had deliberately fitted Devon into the image of a criminal they wanted. He began to suspect that the officers had decided that a dark-skinned guy from a poor neighborhood would be perfect for closing the case and pleasing the brass with a quick result. Further investigation led Elias to a strange finding in the evidence. It turned out that a key piece of evidence, a glove found near the crime scene, had been presented as proof of Devon's involvement. However, Hunt noted that police did not conduct a full DNA and fingerprint analysis. They claimed it was unnecessary because they already had a suitable suspect. This fact could have played into the hands of the defense the lack of analysis indicated that the investigation was rushed and botched. Finally, Hunt had access to surveillance footage not only on the street where the robbery occurred, but also on neighboring blocks. He decided to see if the figure the cameras had captured could indeed be linked to where Devon had been before his arrest. After several hours of reviewing the footage, he came across an unexpected discovery. A different figure had been recorded near the store minutes before the robbery, a man wearing similar clothing but clearly older than Devon, with a different build and more confident movements. This was another clue that indicated that the perpetrator could have been a different person, but the police decided to ignore this detail in order to close the case. Gathering all these inconsistencies, Elias realized that he had a strong case for Devon's defense. He saw that the case was built on superficial judgments, biased testimony, and hasty conclusions. The judge and the police wanted the public to believe the teenager was guilty without delving into the evidence and details. But Hunt knew that if he brought all these strange inconsistencies to the surface, the truth would begin to surface, and the system would have no choice but to admit its mistakes. As Elias Hunt continued to delve deeper into the case, he felt more and more that there was more than just personal views behind Judge Miller's bias. His intuition told him that this was a case the judge was not only considering, but perhaps trying to control. Miller had been overly assertive and aggressive in his treatment of Devon, almost as if he was certain of his guilt beforehand and was anxious to hasten a conviction. It went beyond simple bias. Hunt began to suspect that the judge might have had personal motives closely related to the case. Elias decided to gather information about Miller himself in order to better understand his behavior. In his research, he discovered that Miller had for many years had close ties with the upper classes and certain businessmen in town. Prominent among them was an influential businessman named Gerald Rivers, who was also the owner of the very jewelry store where the robbery occurred. Hunt knew that the judge could not have been so blatant in showing his bias if he had not been backed by someone powerful. Now he began to suspect that Rivers might have been pressuring Miller to convict and close the case as quickly as possible. Hunt began researching Miller and Rivers' relationship. It turned out that their ties go back a long way. They went to the same college together and were rumored to be involved in questionable deals. Judge Miller helped Rivers avoid several scandals involving financial fraud. Rivers, in turn, donated generously to Miller's election campaigns, supporting his judicial career. These facts were known only to a few, but they were the facts that cast a shadow over the judge's reputation. Hunt, feeling that he had dug to dangerous depths, continued his investigation and discovered that the case might have been part of a scheme. Devon, in fact, was a convenient target because in the eyes of the court and the public, he seemed to be a typical criminal who fit the general stereotype. This allowed Rivers and Miller to easily promote their version of events. Elias realized that Rivers didn't just need to find someone guilty, he needed to find someone who didn't have the ability to defend himself. And a dark-skinned teenager from a poor neighborhood fit that criteria perfectly. At one of the hearings, Hunt, plucking up courage, decided to ask a few questions that might hint at the judge's ties to Rivers. He gently asked why the judge refused to consider Devon's alibi and why he was so adamant about ignoring the obvious gaps in the case. Miller interrupted him immediately, not even letting him finish his question. His face became tense, anger in his voice. "You're here to defend your client, Mr. Hunt, not to question the authority of the court and its decisions." Miller growled. It was unusual for a judge. Normally he kept his cool, but here his reaction seemed unnaturally sharp and personal. Elias knew he was on the right track. He began to look even harder for evidence that would confirm the connection between Miller and Rivers. After much searching, he found a small detail that could be key. A few years ago, Rivers had been charged with tax evasion. The court case was handled, as it turned out, by Miller, who managed to get Rivers acquitted of most of the charges. This fact was not well known, as it was carefully concealed, but it seemed that this long-standing favor was the foundation of their corrupt connection. Hunt soon learned another shocking detail. Rivers' wife was a longtime friend of Judge Miller's wife, and their families often spent time together at private events. These connections explained why Judge Miller had been so aggressive against Devon. For him, the case was not just a legal matter, but an opportunity to do a favor for a close friend and associate. Miller did not want anyone to know about these connections, much less have them come to light in a lawsuit. Elias realized that evidence of the judge's personal interest could change the course of the case, but he also knew that such accusations could make him the enemy of all who were associated with Rivers and Miller. Judge Miller was a powerful man who had influence in many areas. However, despite the risk, Hunt decided to use this dirt to bring Miller to justice. Elias began preparing for the next hearing, intent on asking the judge's uncomfortable questions and uncovering at least some of the truth. He knew that if he could prove Miller's bias and his connection to Rivers, it would be a powerful blow to the entire system behind this bogus accusation. Hunt was ready for a fight both for Devon and for the truth that had been hidden for so long behind the walls of judges, chambers, and wealthy homes. Now the case became not just a fight to exonerate a teenager, but to expose the dark connections that permeated city government. Elias Hunt became more and more convinced every day that Devon's case had been artificially fabricated. Many of the details didn't add up, and the evidence that supposedly proved the teenager's guilt was almost ghostly. But to prove it in court, Hunt needed hard facts. He knew that if he could prove the evidence had been tampered with, the entire prosecution case would collapse and the truth would come out. Hunt decided to contact a private investigator he knew well and trusted. His acquaintance, Mark Lewis, was a master of physical evidence and could analyze it for tampering. Mark studied all the documents and evidence that the police had provided. The first thing he noticed were the fingerprints. The file claimed that a glove with Devon's fingerprints had been found at the crime scene. However, upon checking, it was discovered that the fingerprint examination was flawed and the test results did not match the claims in the police reports. The glove was an ordinary, store-bought glove without any obvious traces of DNA, which seemed odd. Mark and Elias decided to re-examine the evidence. After careful analysis, it turned out that the glove in the case had been planted. The glove itself was clean, and there were no traces of DNA or sweat, which would inevitably be left behind if it had been worn by the real culprit. This discovery was the first signal to Hunt that the case was a fabrication. Next, the lawyer decided to analyze the evidence with surveillance footage. The police provided a video that allegedly showed a teenager with dark skin running away from the scene. However, Mark noticed that the video was cropped. The timecode of the recording showed that several seconds between frames had been cut. This meant that the police had deliberately cut the footage to cover up part of the events. Either the perpetrator may not have been alone, or perhaps someone else appeared in the video, and this was not part of the version the police had built up. Hunt then decided to ask a neighboring store owner for access to the original surveillance footage that had not gone through the police. To his luck, one of the store owners turned out to be an honest and decent man who was surprised to hear that the police had long ago seized the recordings and returned them. He didn't understand why anyone would want to edit the tapes and agreed to help Hunt. When the lawyer and Mark reviewed the original tape, they saw an important detail. A few minutes before the robbery, another person had glimpsed outside the jewelry store a man in dark clothes. Judging by his build, was much older than Devon. In that footage, he stood near the door of the store and appeared to search his pockets for something before quickly walking away. Hunt realized that the tape changed the case dramatically. The perpetrator could have been a different person, and the police might have deliberately excluded this fragment to create an image of Devon as the culprit. Mark and Hunt's observations left no doubt someone had tampered with the evidence to make Devon look like a criminal. However, they had no concrete evidence of who exactly was behind the evidence tampering. Hunt decided to go back to the beginning and examine the arrest report. A review of the record revealed that the police officers who detained Devon had a less than clean reputation. One of them, Officer Carter, had previously been involved in questionable situations and had been accused of mistreating detainees and even tampering with evidence in a previous case. Carter, however, was able to avoid charges thanks to the support of his superiors. Hunt began to suspect that Carter was not just a participant in the arrest, but was actively involved in tampering with evidence to charge the teenager with a crime he did not commit. When Hunt accessed the arrest report, his suspicions were confirmed. Carter and his partner were the first to arrive at the crime scene and stated that they immediately found the glove. with Devon's alleged fingerprints. They did so even before the forensic team arrived. This discovery meant that the police had created evidence to substantiate the charge. Hunt realized that to complete the picture, he had to find a way to present the facts about the evidence tampering in court, while remaining cautious, for he knew that Judge Miller could thwart his efforts in every way possible. He decided not to divulge all of his findings at once, but to prepare his defense carefully so that he could make the disclosure at the appropriate moment. Elias began to strategize. At the next court hearing, he was going to ask Officer Carter some leading questions that might lead him to make a mistake. Hunt knew that if Carter became nervous, it might make everyone in the room suspicious. Carter and Judge Miller were links in the same chain, and the more facts Hunt gathered, the clearer this dark picture became. The teenager was the victim of a biased and corrupt system where evidence was manipulated and charges were framed to suit the interests of those at the top. Now Elias had a mission, not just to prove Devon's innocence, but to expose Judge Miller and the police officers who were part of the jury scheme. He had a dangerous and difficult battle ahead of him, but now he knew the truth was on his side. The trial began in an oppressive silence. All eyes were fixed on the judges and lawyers, but most of all on Judge Miller, whose presence on the bench created an atmosphere of outright hostility. The people in the room sensed that the judge had decided this case in advance, and this was evident in his every look, gesture, and word. He hardly ever looked at the defense, and when he did look at Devon, his gaze was heavy, penetrating, full of obvious contempt. When Elias Hunt began his defense, Judge Miller irritably interrupted him at every turn, not allowing him to finish his thought. Every word, every phrase the lawyer uttered irritated Miller, as if he didn't think he was worthy of even listening to the defense. The audience in the hall began to glance around, sensing that something was amiss. Miller did not show the same hostility toward the prosecution. On the contrary, he greeted the prosecutor with a respectful nod, listened to his arguments with obvious pleasure, and often nodded approvingly. Judge Miller made some caustic comments from the outset when Hunt presented facts showing that Devon's alibi had been ignored. Miller smiled dismissively and said with a note of venomous sarcasm, "I suppose an alibi from his relatives should convince us, right? We all know how such families cover for each other," he pronounced, making no secret of his outright contempt. Those words sounded particularly cruel. Miller was generalizing, clearly alluding to the racial identity of Devon and his family, and the phrase was not just derogatory, but racist. Several people in the room exchanged shocked glances, and Hunt felt his anger boiling up inside him. Elias, hardly containing himself, continued his defense. He began to talk about the tampered evidence, about the inconsistencies in the police testimony, but as soon as he mentioned the strange details about the glove, the judge interrupted him again, not allowing him to finish his thought. "Mr. Hunt, you're boring us with these conspiracy theories," Miller said in a cold and dismissive tone. "Are you trying to make this teenager a victim of the system? Or maybe you think the police are incapable of an honest investigation when it comes to this kind of type of person?" His words were filled with such venom that several people in the audience gasped. There was no longer any doubt. Judge Miller wasn't just biased, he was a racist who openly displayed his hatred. Hunt, gritting his teeth, continued, trying to suppress a rising sense of anger. He decided to bring up the surveillance tapes to show that the police had cut out important moments that could exonerate Devon. But as soon as he uttered the word tapes, Miller exclaimed sharply, "Are you at it again, Mr. Hunt? These records have already been checked by competent people who probably know their business better than you do. In this court, we're not going to consider your FACA evidence fantasy." The judge seemed to just cheer, not allowing the defense attorney to reveal a single argument. And every time Hunt spoke, Miller signaled to the prosecutor to object to the defense. This behavior was so obvious that even disinterested spectators began to whisper, realizing that the judge was deliberately pressuring the defense and not giving it a chance. The judge's every word was poisoned with bias. He allowed himself to talk about Devon as if the teenager had already been convicted. Once he even threw a derogatory comment in the defendant's direction. "I'm surprised he hasn't ended up in the dock yet at that age, but I guess it's just a matter of time, isn't it?" Miller grinned again, his voice so loud that everyone in the room could hear it. Hunt noticed the flicker of fear mixed with humiliation in Devon's eyes. The teenager Saturday with his head down, realizing that to the judge he was just a stereotype, the embodiment of every negative prejudice. Judge Miller seemed to have no fear that anyone could interface with him. He felt omnipotent, as if he knew that his connections and reputation would protect him from any accusations. When Hunt attempted to ask further questions of Officer Carter, who had been involved in Devon's arrest, Miller interrupted him. Without allowing him to ask any of the important questions, his irritation turned to barely concealed hatred. "Mr. Hunt, I'm warning you, stop being distracted by irrelevant details. This court is no place for your games," Miller said loudly, raising his hand to call order in the room. The audience frowned. This behavior was a clear show of force and an attempt to intimidate the lawyer. Miller was openly displaying his hostility, and the tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Elias saw those who had come to support Devon clench their fists, trying not to show their anger. He sensed that the entire room was watching this unequal battle, realizing that the fight was not only for the teenager's freedom, but also against a system where people like Judge Miller felt untouchable. Hunt, however, was not about to back down. He realized that Devon's only chance was to expose Miller's bias and the fraud in the case right in court, but he also knew that the judge would do everything in his power to prevent him from doing so. Elias Hunt left the courtroom, feeling the weight weighing more heavily on his shoulders than ever before. Judge Miller's hostility, his caustic comments and mocking remarks made it clear that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep the case alive and Devon convicted. But Hunt wasn't about to back down. He knew he had the truth on his side, which meant he had a chance to shatter this carefully constructed lie. Soon, however, the pressure on him began to mount. As soon as Hunt left the court, he received a phone call from an unknown number. A male voice, calm but full of an underlying threat, said, "Mr. Hunt, we know you're a tenacious man, but sometimes it's best to back down. This case is not for you. We advise you to think about your career and safety." Elias frowned. He knew he was working with dangerous people, but he hadn't expected a direct threat. He realized this wasn't just an attempt to intimidate him, it was a sign that the judge and his entourage would spring into action. They knew Hunt was taking the deep, and now they wanted to make him go away. A few days later, two men in strict suits appeared on his doorstep, identifying themselves as consultants. They invited him to a small restaurant, where they bluntly stated that the interests of certain people demanded a quick conclusion to the case. One of the men, looking intently at Hunt, added, "Miller is a man of respect, and we all know that he always acts in the public interest. His reputation is impeccable, and if anyone tries to tarnish it, it will not be without consequences." Elias remained silent, feeling his anger boiling over, but held back, knowing he might be provoked into rash action. He replied coldly, "My duty is to protect my client, and if you are truly confident in Judge Miller's impeccability, you have nothing to worry about." The man only grinned and let it be known that this was a warning and the next step could be much more painful. The next day, Hunt discovered that his mailbox had been broken into and some of his documents had disappeared. He realized that the pressure was building, and his entourage began to feel it as well. His assistant Sandra, who was helping him with the case, came to work agitated and reported that unknown people had come to her and asked questions about Hunt and his working methods. After a few more days, calls and messages began, blatantly threatening his family. The voice on the other end of the phone said, "Mr. Hunt, think about your daughter. After all, she seems to be attending a high school nearby. You have to admit, trouble can happen anywhere if someone persists in going where they shouldn't." That call was the last straw. Hunt felt fear for his loved ones mingle with rage. He was surrounded on all sides, and now he realized that Judge Miller and his protectors were ready to break him by any means necessary. He found himself alone against a powerful system, ready to erase him from his memory if he didn't stop. Nevertheless, Elias realized that to back down was to betray not only Devon, but himself, his mission, and the memory of his brother, who had been ruined by the same system. He knew that by quitting, he would not only lose his reputation, but also let Miller and his men know that they could intimidate and humiliate people without hindrance. But with each passing day, the threat to his life and the lives of his family became more real. To keep his family safe, Hunt sent them to relatives outside the city for a while without giving them the details. He knew he couldn't put them in danger, but he was determined to follow through. Elias began sleeping in his office, avoiding showing up at home and moving around the city more cautiously than ever. He decided that at the next hearing, he would open some of the evidence he had collected and begin to lay out his suspicions about Judge Miller. At the next hearing, when Hunt again talked about the oddities in the case and the tampered evidence, Judge Miller seemed to lose control. He began interrupting the lawyer again, but now with a much more aggressive tone. "Are you going to continue to waste our time with these filthy insinuations? Mr. Hunt," he growled, "I decide what's important in this room, not you." Hunt, feeling the whole room at his back, replied with restraint, "I have good reason to believe that the evidence has been falsified and that the case is essentially built on prejudicial conclusions and manipulation. And if the court deems it necessary, I am ready to present all my evidence." But Miller, with a face flushed with anger, sharply rejected all of counsel's motions. "You're out of line, Mr. Hunt," he almost shouted. "This court is no place for self-parody. I advise you to stick to the facts and respect the established order." Elias had no doubt Miller and his entourage knew the lawyer was getting too close to the truth, and trying to get him to back off was a desperate attempt to keep their dark secrets. When the meeting was over, Hunt left the room, but now he knew for sure the threat was real, and his opponent was willing to do anything to hide the truth. Elias Hunt realized that his harassment and threats were not only due to Judge Miller's stubbornness and bias. It was becoming clear to him every day this case was personal to many behind Devon's prosecution. But Hunt didn't have the definitive evidence to argue it in court. That all changed when he was approached by an unexpected ally, a woman named Marilyn Hale. Marilyn worked as a secretary at a law firm known for its ties to the local elite. She had been following the case, and as she watched Miller and his entourage tighten around Hunt, she realized that there was no justice in sight. After much deliberation and internal struggle, Marilyn made up her mind. She came to Hunt with an offer to help by providing information she possessed, information that could turn the whole case upside down. When they met, Marilyn looked around nervously, handed him several copies of the documents, and asked him not to mention her name. When Elias began to study the documents, his heart beat faster. There was information there that he couldn't find any other way. These documents revealed a connection between Judge Miller and local wealthy influential people, among whom Gerald Rivers, the very owner of the jewelry store that had been robbed, stood out. According to the documents, Rivers not only knew Miller, but also participated in his career advancement, generously funding his campaigns and assisting him at critical moments. Miller, in turn, repeatedly assisted Rivers in the courts, turning a blind eye to his wrongdoing and granting him immunity. Seeing this connection, Hunt began to understand why Miller was so aggressively defending the prosecution's case and trying to convict Devon by any means necessary. He was doing so at Rivers' behest. But that was not all. One of the documents contained references to another individual, Mr. Hayward, a large real estate developer who had been sued numerous times for illegal actions, but had always gotten away with it. It turned out that Hayward and Rivers were business partners and were planning a big project on the side of the poor neighborhood where Devon lived. They needed to clear the area, and one of the plans included a demonstration of crime in the neighborhood to defame the residents and deny them the ability to defend their rights. Hayward and Rivers' project, as Hunt found out, depended on their ability to convince the city council and investors that the neighborhood was a criminal nest in need of cleanup. The idea was simple: create an image of a criminally dangerous place to easily gain support for its demolition and renovation. They deliberately used the Devon case as proof of their thesis, and Miller was their key ally. Elias realized with horror that Devon was not just a convenient victim, but a pawn in this big game. His arrest, the charges, the trial, it was all part of an elaborate scheme. Miller, Rivers, and Hayward teamed up to use the teenager as a tool to accomplish their goals. They wanted to turn him into the epitome of neighborhood crime in order to destroy his very identity and open the way for their project. And Devon and his family became the victims of this cruel plan. Now Hunt had a choice. He could retreat, realizing what a powerful adversary he faced, or he could continue to fight despite the risks. After comparing all the facts, Elias realized that he had evidence of a corrupt connection between Miller and his interests that threatened the justice system itself. At the next trial, Hunt decided to disclose some of the information he had obtained. He carefully provided the court and the audience with the context of Judge Miller's relationship with Rivers, hinting that the relationship might have affected the objectivity of the court. As soon as he said this, there was a tense silence in the room. Judge Miller literally turned red with anger and attempted to interrupt him immediately. "Mr. Hunt, you're overstepping acceptable boundaries again. We are not here to discuss personal matters. I demand that you cease this line of defense immediately, or you will face the consequences," Miller shouted, his voice shaking with rage and panic flickering in his eyes. But Hunt did not stop there. He calmly but firmly stated, "I have a reasonable suspicion that the judge's personal interests and long-standing connections with certain individuals may be influencing the course of this case. I have enough evidence to raise questions about the impartiality of this trial." His words were like a blow to Miller's reputation, and he realized that the situation was getting out of hand. While Miller was trying to gather his strength, several people from the audience began to discuss what they had heard, and the atmosphere in the room became heated. For the first time during the trial, people began to doubt the integrity of the judge and felt that this trial was more than just an investigation of a crime. Elias Hunt knew that by revealing this secret, he had crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. Now all he had to do was go forward and seek justice, exposing anyone who tried to build wealth and power on the fate of people like Devon. After uncovering Judge Miller's ties to Gerald Rivers and his associates, Elias Hunt realized he had touched the tip of the iceberg, but he sensed there were even darker and more tangled secrets lurking behind it. To understand who he was dealing with, Elias began researching the judge's background, his career, and the people he had interacted with outside the court. His private investigator Mark Lewis, who had already helped him with the evidence in the case, began to dig deeper, and soon he was able to find information that stunned Hunt. It turned out that in his youth, Judge Miller had been closely associated with a group of people who had ties to the underworld. These men, who called themselves guardians of order, operated within wealthy and gated communities where prejudice and hatred of people of other races and backgrounds were part of the unwritten laws. Elias was surprised to discover that one of Miller's old friends, one Victor Hart, had been convicted of corruption and money laundering, as well as involvement in illegal real estate fraud. Hart, who had known Miller since college, often turned to him for help in the courts. Miller, however, being ambitious but unscrupulous, helped him avoid justice and was handsomely rewarded for it. In addition, the archives revealed that Miller had ties to organizations that promoted discriminatory ideas and supported economic and social oppression. This explained his deep dislike of people of another race, which was evident even in his work. He could remain impeccably cold and impartial on paper, but behind this facade lay a real hatred that he directed against those he considered inferior. But that wasn't all. Hunt discovered that Miller had received a substantial sum from a real estate deal several years earlier, and the deal was closely tied to the projects of his current ally, Gerald Rivers. According to the paperwork, the deal was in Miller's name, and the money he received went ostensibly as compensation for services. Elias realized that this was a common money laundering scheme used by many corrupt judges and officials. Elias learned another startling fact. Several years ago, when Miller was just starting out, he had been involved in a scandal with police officers who accused him of aiding drug traffickers. According to rumors, he covered several criminal authorities in exchange for financial gain and favor for the benefit of his career. The scandal was hushed up as Miller then found a patron among influential people who helped him to avoid punishment and hide his past. But the rumors left a shadow on his reputation among those who knew his story. Elias realized with horror how deep Miller was in the criminal milieu that he had so skillfully disguised. Under the guise of a respectable judge, the outward image of an unyielding and strict upholder of law and order concealed a man willing to use his power for personal enrichment and revenge. For him, Devon was only a symbol of the threat that he had fought so hard to strengthen his position. Realizing the extent of Miller's dark past, Elias decided he had to bring it to light. He knew that if he could prove in court that Miller was involved in corruption and criminal ties, it would not only set Devon free, but also destroy the judge's career once and for all. Exposing him as a corrupt and biased man, Hunt began collecting everything he could: copies of transactions, financial documents, testimonies from the judge's former acquaintances who weren't afraid to tell the truth. At the next meeting, when Miller again tried to stop him and precipitate his defensive statements, Hunt felt that the moment had come to strike. He stood up, maintaining his cold composure, and announced, "Dear court, I am compelled to raise the question of the impartiality of the judge who is presiding over this case. I have evidence that Judge Miller has repeatedly received financial benefits from persons with a direct interest in my client's conviction." The hall frowned. Miller, pale and confused, tried to interrupt, but his voice shook. This is absurd, Mr. Hunt. I will not allow you to turn this court into a circus," he shouted, losing his temper. But Elias didn't stop there. He presented the court with copies of real estate transactions and documents showing Miller's long-standing financial ties to Gerald Rivers and Victor Hart. Hunt described the money laundering schemes and implicated Miller as having overlapping interests with people who were trying to use the case to advance their projects. The spectators in the courtroom were shocked. Now even those who had doubted Devon's innocence realized that the case had been biased from the beginning. Judge Miller's face turned pale, his hands shook, and he could barely speak. He had to call a recess to pull himself together, but his reputation was already damaged, and the room was filled with discussion and indignation. Elias knew that now he had struck a serious blow against Miller. The judge's dark life, his ties to the underworld, and his latent hatred for people of another race were beginning to surface. There was still a long fight ahead, but now Hunt knew the truth was on his side, and he had every reason to free Devon and destroy the empire of lies Miller had so carefully hidden. After Elias Hunt's revelations, the Devon case instantly attracted public attention. Journalists picked up the story, turning it into a real scandal. News headlines were filled with sensationalism. Judge Miller under suspicion, biased justice or systemic corruption, racial prejudice in the courts, scandalous revelations in the case of a teenager, lawyer against the system who will protect the innocent. Each new day brought more questions and assumptions. People in the city who had previously thought the case was just one of the usual crime stories now began to realize that it was about something much deeper: systemic injustice, discrimination, and corruption at the level of the judiciary. People started asking questions, coming to the hearings, demanding explanations. Many community activists and human rights groups began publicly speaking out in support of Devon and demanding an independent investigation of Judge Miller. Reporters gathered everything they could find about his past cases, and soon articles appeared revealing Miller's sentencing statistics. It turned out that in most cases, he gave harsher sentences to people of other races, especially teenagers from poor neighborhoods. This undermined the credibility of his immaculate reputation and caused many to question the fairness of justice. Elias Hunt found himself at the center of this maelstrom. The phones in his office were ringing constantly. Journalists, lawyers, and representatives of human rights organizations wanted to know the details of the case and offer assistance. Elias realized that this case was now not just about Devon, but about a system in which the likes of Miller were given power and the ability to manipulate trials. He knew this was a rare opportunity to use media attention to influence the system. Meanwhile, protests began to spread outside the courthouse. People gathered outside the courthouse with placards demanding justice for Devon and an investigation of Judge Miller. Placards reading "Justice for all," "The court is no place for hate," and "Expose Miller" began to appear at each session. Some activists organized petitions and called for the judge's resignation. The pressure on Miller grew daily, and now he could not ignore the anger and suspicion directed in his direction. When the case was discussed in the media, other attorneys were interviewed about Miller's past bias and harsh sentences. One of the attorneys, who remained anonymous, told reporters of cases in which Miller blatantly ignored evidence of the innocence of defendants, especially if they were from poor neighborhoods or of a different race. There was a growing public belief that Judge Miller was not the man he was once thought to be. Elias knew that public and media pressure was critical because it was what was causing Miller and his circle to lose control. But he also knew that Miller and his allies had enough power and influence to try to turn the situation in their favor. One day, just before the trial began, a young reporter from a local TV station approached Hunt and quietly said, "Elias, be careful. I have sources who say there is a campaign being prepared against you. They want to discredit you, make you look like a self-promoter, accuse you of fudging the facts, and even hint at bribery. You should be prepared for your own methods to come under scrutiny." Elias nodded gratefully. He knew it wasn't just a rumor. Judge Miller and his supporters, including powerful men like Gerald Rivers, were not going down without a fight, and now, under public pressure, were looking for any way they could to undermine his reputation. Soon articles appeared that hinted that Elias was allegedly using the case for personal gain and fame. But fortunately, the support from the public was much stronger. People realized that much more was at stake in this case than the reputation of one lawyer. At the same time, Hunt received support from major human rights organizations that became involved in the case. They began preparations for a formal request for a review of all the cases Miller had handled, which increased public pressure and signaled to the court that this was no longer just another high-profile case. It was now a case that had come to symbolize the fight against discrimination and bias in the judicial system. When Elias began his speech at the next hearing, knowing that there were journalists in the audience, he stated clearly and firmly, "My client, a young man whom the system is trying to portray as a criminal, was a victim of bias and corruption. But this case is not only about his fate. This case is about justice and the right of every person to a fair trial. We cannot allow bias and personal interests to block people's way to the truth." Hunt's words drew applause from the audience, and for the first time Miller looked genuinely excited. A shadow of fear flickered in his eyes, and he realized that he was losing control of the case and of public opinion. Now, he could no longer ignore the public pressure and definite support, and even his co-workers were starting to look askance at him. Each day, the case attracted more and more people, and that support strengthened Hunt's resolve to see it through. There was still a long-awaited battle ahead, but now he knew he had an army of allies, and a case that began as a simple defense of an innocent teenager had become a symbol of the fight against a corrupt system that had become the jailer of justice. There was a deafening silence in the courtroom. Everyone was waiting for the beginning of the hearing, feeling that something significant was going to happen today. The tension was almost palpable, and not just because of the importance of the case. The public attention, media pressure, and accusations against Judge Miller made the session the culmination of a long and intense struggle. Miller, stone-faced in his black robe, took his seat, looking intently at Elias Hunt, who stood next to Devin. Elias was collected and calm, though he realized that today was the day his confrontation with Miller would reach its peak. He knew that the judge was well aware of how close Hunt was to destroying his reputation and exposing that entire system that supported the prosecution. Hunt sensed that Miller was willing to do anything to maintain his status and hold on to his power over the case. As soon as the meeting began, Elias got up and stood in front of the judge. "Your Honor," he began, trying to maintain an even, confident tone, "our investigation has revealed serious irregularities in the investigation of this case. Moreover, we have evidence that evidence tampering and bias were the basis of the charges against my client, and I am compelled to raise again the question of a possible connection between the parties interested in the outcome of the case and Your Honor." Judge Miller looked up slowly, his eyes glittering coldly. He stared at Hunt with an icy stare, and his voice sounded like a gunshot. "Mr. Hunt, you are once again crossing the line by implying completely false and unfounded assumptions. You should remember that I am here to enforce the law, and your tone is inappropriate. This is your final warning," Miller stated, but his words were full of not just irritation, but a veiled threat. He looked at Hunt as if he saw him as a personal enemy, not a lawyer. Elias met that gaze for a moment, feeling the pressure, but it did not waver. On the contrary, he felt strength from the support of the people who were on his side, and from the certainty of the rightness of his cause. "Your Honor," he continued calmly, "your warnings and attempts to interrupt my presentation have already prevented a full and fair hearing several times. I ask that the court pay attention to the fact that systematic pressure and prevent me from defending my client properly." The people in the hall held their breath as they watched this confrontation. The tension was becoming almost unbearable, and Miller, feeling that his power in the hall was beginning to falter, stood up, addressing everyone present. "That's enough, Mr. Hunt. You and your baseless accusations undermine the authority of the court." His voice shook with restrained anger. You're using this situation to make yourself look like a hero, but I warn you the court's patience has its limits. Elias didn't allow himself to show fear or doubt for a second. Instead, he took a step forward and said with icy calm, "Your Honor, patience and justice are not the same thing. My client has already been deprived of his right to a fair trial, and I do not intend to watch in silence as his fate is decided in an atmosphere of threats and bias." Judge Miller, whose hand clenched into a fist, making a barely perceptible movement, for the first time could not restrain a flash of anger. He hissed, "Barely restrained. You don't know who you're dealing with. Mr. Hunt, I can make you regret every word you say." These words spoken in the courtroom caused shock and excited whispers. Miller had crossed the line, and his threats were no longer veiled. The spectators in the room exchanged glances. They saw before them not an objective judge, but a man who would do anything to destroy anyone who threatened his position and reputation. Elias, without taking his eyes off Miller, stated emphatically, "I'm not here to fear or obey threats. Your Honor, I'm here to defend the innocent. And if the truth is threatening your reputation, then perhaps you should question why that is happening." Judge Miller, out of control, banged his gavel so hard that the sound echoed through the room. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down, and without looking at Hunt, called a recess, preventing him from continuing. When he left the hall, the audience was left in shock. No one expected to see such a vivid confrontation between the judge and the lawyer. The journalists in the hall immediately began to record what they had heard and discuss what had happened. Many realized that this day was a turning point in the case. Miller was now not just a biased judge, but a man whose dark intentions began to be revealed before everyone's eyes. Elias Hunt, standing in the audience, felt a sense of satisfaction. He knew he had forced Miller to reveal his true nature. Now he had to see it through to the end, shattering the illusion of infallibility and permissiveness that Miller had tried to maintain for years. The next day of the court session, the room was packed. After yesterday's open confrontation between Elias Hunt and Judge Miller, the public, journalists, and the community realized that today could be a decisive day. Tension was in the air, and everyone, from ordinary spectators to the judge himself, expected that the lawyer might present new evidence that would finally undermine Miller's authority. When the session began, Elias rose and addressed the court. "Your Honor, today I would like to introduce a surprise witness who is willing to tell the truth about the tampering of evidence and point out the involvement of people closely connected to this case." Judge Miller frowned for a moment, his gaze becoming suspicious and wary. It was unexpected. He tried to keep his composure, but everyone could see his fingers turn white with tension as he gripped the armrests of his chair tightly. He spoke slowly, with pressure. "Mr. Hunt, I hope your witness is truly important and directly relevant to the case. If not, the consequences will be serious." Elias nodded confidently and invited the witness in. The doors of the hall opened and a man whom few expected to see entered. It was Police Detective Richard Grayson, who had worked closely with Judge Miller and his entourage in the past. Grayson, who had been on the police force for many years, was known as an honest but always standing in the shadows man who saw and knew much more than met the eye. Judge Miller could not hide his surprise, and for a moment his face contorted. Elias saw the judge's eyes narrow, as if he were trying to hold back a sudden burst of anger. He clearly hadn't expected to see his old acquaintance here, and as a witness for the defense. Grayson sat down on the witness stand and took the oath. Elias stepped toward him and began. "Detective Grayson, you've worked with the court for a long time and have been involved in the investigation of numerous cases. You are also familiar with Judge Miller and a number of high-ranking people. Is that correct?" Grayson nodded, his voice firm, but his eyes read determination. "Yes, that's true. I've worked with Judge Miller and have known him for years." Elias continued. "Mr. Grayson, you mentioned to me that you have information about possible tampering with evidence in this case. Can you tell me what you know?" Grayson took a deep breath and spoke. "Yes, I have information that should have been presented to the court back at the investigation stage, but somehow disappeared from the case. The evidence found at the crime scene, including the glove, was planted. I know the details of this tampering, and what's more, I know who was involved." An excited whisper resounded in the hall. The statement was shocking. Judge Miller sat motionless, but the tension emanating from him was palpable. His face remained impassive, but everyone in the room sensed that fear lurked beneath the mask. Elias nodded and asked the next question. "Oh, to your knowledge, was involved in the evidence tampering?" Grayson, after a pause, replied, "Officer Carter, who was first on the scene, along with a couple other officers, had instructions to secure the prosecution in this case. I learned that those instructions were coming from an individual with close ties to Judge Miller." Now there was a real commotion in the courtroom. The spectators and journalists were shocked by what they had heard, and even the prosecutor looked confused. Hunt asked the question again. "Detective Grayson, you mentioned that the instructions were coming from a man closely associated with Judge Miller. Can you name that person?" Grayson nodded, his voice remaining firm. "This is Gerald Rivers, a powerful businessman and jewelry store owner who is known to be on close terms with Judge Miller. Rivers has been demanding that the police close the case against Devon as quickly as possible and with a conviction, even if they have to tamper with evidence to do so." Judge Miller turned pale. He interrupted sharply. "That's enough. This testimony is irrelevant and speculation. Mr. Hunt, stop this interrogation immediately or I will suspend you." But Elias was not going to back down. He looked straight at the judge and said, "Your Honor, Detective Grayson is a competent witness, and his testimony is directly relevant to the case. Moreover, his words may explain why the prosecution's case against my client was built on such dubious evidence." Miller couldn't find anything to say. His power over the room was beginning to erode, and he realized it. Grayson continued his testimony, recounting how he had been unofficially offered to turn a blind eye to the falsifications in exchange for a promotion. He also recounted how people working with Rivers had been following the case and manipulating witness testimony and evidence in every way possible. After this testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Now not only the public, but also Miller's colleagues began to wonder about his involvement in the case. Grayson was the unexpected witness who broke down the last barriers that had kept Miller and his entourage from justice. Elias knew that with this testimony, he was closer to victory. He now had testimony to prove that the prosecution's case against Devon was built on bias and criminal conspiracy. Judge Miller was silent, but everyone knew his secret life, his ties to the underworld, and his willingness to destroy an innocent teenager for personal gain were now exposed to the world. Detective Grayson's words were the spark that started the fire. The revelations of evidence, tampering, and Gerald Rivers' direct involvement in the case against Devon not only shocked the courtroom, but were the beginning of the end for Judge Miller. Shortly after the hearing, even darker and more frightening details of his judicial record surfaced, leading to a public review of his past cases. The next day, when the article about Grayson's testimony appeared in the city's major newspapers, a scandal erupted. The headline screamed, "Corrupt Judge, the truth about the judicial system that was supposed to protect us and influence and money. How Judge Miller manipulated justice for his allies." Reporters have been relentless in uncovering new details. Several human rights organizations filed formal requests to review previous cases Miller had handled. Old accusations of his rudeness, bias, and harshness in sentencing, especially in cases involving minorities and poor citizens, were recalled. Under pressure from the public and human rights organizations, the court was forced to launch an internal investigation into Miller himself. The members of the court, who had previously respected him and considered him a reliable professional, now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. They could not turn a blind eye to the facts that surfaced in the course of the investigation. Elias Hunt, realizing that he now had to finish his enemy in the courtroom, collected additional evidence. He presented evidence that Miller's cases repeatedly involved tampering with evidence and pressuring witnesses, especially if the defendants were from poor neighborhoods or belonged to racial minorities. With each new fact Hunt presented, Miller's reputation crumbled faster and faster, like a house of cards. One after another, all cases surfaced in which Miller deliberately ignored the alibis of the accused and handed down harsh sentences without sufficient evidence. In one case, a young man accused of robbery repeatedly claimed to have been across town at the time of the crime, as witnesses confirmed, but Miller rejected all defense testimony, sentencing him to a lengthy prison term. The man later died in prison without ever receiving justice. Now, with a new investigation, the community has realized that this case was not the only one. Each new fact was like another nail in the coffin of Miller's reputation. The judge looked haggard at the hearings. His face darkened and his eyes lost their former luster. In an attempt to preserve at least the remnants of his career and protect himself, Miller began to show increasingly harsh and aggressive reactions to Hunt's speeches. He no longer tried to hide his hostility, which, in fact, only confirmed his bias. At one meeting, Miller tried to suppress yet another piece of evidence presented by Hunt, saying it was irrelevant and unreliable. But Elias, feeling stronger than ever, firmly responded, "Your Honor, this isn't just evidence, it's the voice of people who have suffered under a system that you, Judge Miller, have perverted to suit your own interests. This evidence is a chance for those who have been wronged to finally get justice." These words drew applause from the audience, and Miller could not contain his anger. At that moment it was clear his power over the court was lost. His status no longer inspiring fear in anyone. It soon became clear that some of Miller's colleagues, realizing that his position had become too weak, began to distance themselves from him. People with whom he had worked side by side suddenly began to say that they had always suspected him of bias, but were afraid to speak out. It was like the fall of a dictator surrounded by his associates, who suddenly decided to turn their backs on him. At the next hearing, Hunt presented another sensational financial documents confirming large transfers to Miller's accounts, made through front companies linked to Rivers and other influential businessmen. This was the last straw, and now even the judge's most loyal allies could not defend him. Everyone realized that Miller had lost not only his authority, but also his legal right to administer justice. Miller could no longer hide his despair. His eyes were panic-stricken, his face pallid, and he seemed to be struggling to keep himself from snapping. He desperately tried to justify himself to his colleagues, claiming that all the accusations against him were a mixture of coincidences and false interpretations. But those words no longer convinced anyone. His voice, once confident and firm, now sounded pitiful, and fear flickered in his eyes. When the final decision to reconsider his cases was made, Miller couldn't take it anymore. His face was covered with cold sweat. He turned pale and realized that he had lost. He left the final session hunched over and looking down, knowing that he would now face a trial, not as a judge, but as a defendant. The reputation he had spent years building was destroyed. Miller became a symbol of a corrupt and biased judicial system, and Devon's case became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice. Elias Hunt, who risked everything to defend an innocent teenager, won a historic victory, proving that even the most powerful can be defeated when courage and determination are on the side of truth. Amid the high-profile scandal and Judge Miller's crumbling reputation, Elias Hunt continued to fight for Devon's full acquittal. Public attention, media exposure, and pressure from human rights activists forced the police and prosecutors to re-examine all the evidence in the case. This gave Hunt the opportunity to reanalyze the evidence that had initially been used against his client, and finally a lead emerged that uncovered the truth. Elias was able to obtain a second review of the surveillance footage that captured the events on the night of the robbery. This time, an independent expert not connected to the police or Judge Miller's inner circle was involved in the analysis. The videotapes, which had previously been subjected to a correction, revealed an important new detail. The original recording showed a different man hiding his face under a hood. He was older and larger than Devon, and his gait did not match that of the teenager. In addition, the man appeared to have left the scene shortly before Devon appeared in the neighborhood, which explained the initial suspicions. Previously, the police had managed to cover up this detail by cutting out the necessary footage and fitting the video to Devon's alleged guilt. Now, with the recovered footage, it's clear the teenager happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it had nothing to do with the robbery. That wasn't the only new evidence. However, the private detective Elias had hired had unearthed another detail that no one had noticed at first. A glove supposedly belonging to Devon had been found at the crime scene, and it was used as one of the prosecution's main pieces of evidence. But as it turned out, its origin was also fake. A forensic expert involved in the case confirmed that the glove lacked the biological traces that are usually left when worn. This meant it had been planted The most surprising thing was that the DNA test, which had been done again, showed that the marks on the glove were not Devin's, but someone else's. A man who had ties to Gerald Rivers and had been tried for theft before, but had somehow always gotten away with it. This discovery confirmed that Devin was being made to look like a criminal and the real culprit was being covered up. When Elias presented this final evidence at the trial, the room fell silent again. Judge Miller was no longer in charge of the case. He had been suspended during the investigation, and now another judge was in charge, who listened intently and let Hunt lay out all the facts. Hunt calmly and confidently explained how the evidence had been tampered with and how Devin had been made to look guilty. He showed the recovered video and presented the forensic results of the glove, which proved unequivocally his client was innocent. The prosecutor, who had previously blindly trusted the word of the police, was forced to admit that the evidence did not stand up to scrutiny. His voice was quiet when he finally stated, "In view of the new facts presented, the prosecution can no longer maintain a position of guilt against the accused. We request a review of the verdict." Those words were the moment of truth. There was a tense silence in the courtroom as the judge looked at Elias and Devin and said the long-awaited words, "The court finds grounds for a complete acquittal of the defendant, as the evidence previously presented was tampered with. All charges against Devin Jackson are dismissed." The hall erupted in applause and shouts of joy. Devin, who had been sitting with his head down, finally looked up, tears of relief and gratitude in his eyes. Elias walked over to him, put a hand on his shoulder and smiled, feeling the weight he had been carrying all this time lifted from his own heart. For Devin, it was a moment of liberation, a moment when his life was no longer threatened by someone else's bias and cruelty. He stood before the court, vindicated and free, thanks to the efforts and courage of Hunt, who had not let the system break him. Elias, seeing the smiles and tears of joy in the audience, realized that this was not just the success of one cause. It was the success of all who believed in justice, who were willing to fight despite the dangers and threats. This day was a turning point not only for Devin, but for the entire justice system, which was forced to admit its mistakes. Immediately after Devin's acquittal, the judiciary launched a formal investigation against Judge Miller. Allegations of bias, corruption, and gross miscarriages of justice came down on him with relentless force. His close ties to Gerald Rivers, numerous instances of tampering with evidence and pressuring witnesses were revealed. His public hearings drew national attention, turning Miller from a respected judge into a symbol of a corrupt system. His colleagues and former allies began abandoning him to save their own reputations. Under pressure from human rights organizations, down scenes of his past cases were reviewed for similar violations. Many wrongfully convicted people were released, a powerful blow to the system that had allowed him to operate for so many years. Judge Miller was removed from office and stripped of all privileges. Now he was brought before a court to answer for his crimes. His once unshakable career and power had been shattered. He had become an example that no one was above the law. In the last trial, where the verdict was officially read, the room was packed. Devin sat next to Elias Hunt, tense but with a spark of hope in his eyes. The judge, who is now in charge of the case after Miller's dismissal, rose to announce the final judgment. Devin Jackson has been completely exonerated. The court finds him not guilty of all charges. The charges of tampering with evidence and bias will be dealt with in a separate investigation against those who allowed this injustice to occur. As soon as those words were spoken, Devin breathed a sigh of relief. His family, sitting in the audience, cried tears of joy. For them, this wasn't just the end of a legal nightmare, it was the beginning of a new chapter where they could live without fear, knowing that their son was innocent. After the meeting, Mrs. Jackson hugged Devin tightly, unable to hold back tears. Now that the truth had been restored, their family was regaining its wholeness and peace. Elias, watching their joy, felt a deep satisfaction. He knew the struggle had been hard, but the victory was sweet. Devin, already free and full of hope, thanked Elias, realizing that he now had a chance at a future he had once never dreamed of. Devin Jackson's story went beyond the courtroom and became a symbol. The media, human rights organizations, and ordinary people discussed the case as a clear example of how bias and corruption can destroy the lives of innocent people. The public began to demand reforms aimed at transparency and fairness in the justice system. and Devon's name became an embodiment of the struggle for rights and equality. As the months passed, Devon and his family's life began to return to normal, but nothing could ever be the same again. Devon received many offers of help, scholarships, educational grants, support programs. He decided to go back to school and lit a dream of becoming a lawyer, so he could help others like Elias Hunt had once helped him. His story inspired other teens who also had to fight bias and injustice. The Devon case set off waves of change in society. There was public discussion, calls for reforms of the judicial system, and tighter control over the judiciary and police. Many spoke of the need for an independent oversight body that could review the actions of judges and protect the rights of those who faced injustice. Elias Hunt, now known not only as a successful lawyer, but also as a fighter for truth, became a key figure in the movement for judicial reform. His work and bravery has shown that one person armed with determination and courage can truly make a difference. Elias inspired many young lawyers who saw his story as proof that defending the rights of the innocent is not just a job, but a high mission. Devon's story was a reminder of how important honesty and fairness are, how dangerous bias is, and how change is needed to make sure something like this never happens again. It was a lesson to the whole community, a lesson that everyone deserves a fair trial and that truth and justice must always win, no matter how hard the struggle. Thank you for watching this story to the end. We want to know what you think about what happened to Devon. Have you ever experienced bias or unfair treatment in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Each of you is invaluable to us, and we sincerely appreciate your feedback. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more thought-provoking stories and inspire change. We wish you a good day and, most importantly, justice and peace in every moment.